morning, Ramsey, or good
Ah,
afternoon to you.
good afternoon, good morning, dear Joe. I'm
How
so
are you?
sorry. I'm fine. Yes, I'm just receiving the signal that this is recording. Excellent. And how are you, dear Joe?
I am just fine,
Great,
physically
great,
fine. Yeah.
great. Sorry about the technicalities in trying to get on this
Oh,
screen.
it always happens this way. I've done many podcasts, and every one of them I think has had technical problems. So not to worry about that. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope
Well,
we can, a series of these. My idea is that it's we can do anything you like in any way you want, but one natural thing would be to um, like in the first one, I would simply explain the typological system, maybe talk a little bit about sort of the origin of Caesar's Messiah, explain the typological system about, you know, the the part of it which is in the old that relates, to Jesus's pre-ministry, and then and going forward, just take a series of the parallels in sequence. Like I would say, fishing for men is a very interesting one, in my opinion, and it's never really been discussed in a podcast I've done. So I'd love to do that one, and then just go forward and do enough of them so someone could use, the video collection as a way to understand the whole theory.
that sounds great, dear Joe. That sounds absolutely great. Would you like to go ahead?
Let me just start, and then tell me interrupt any time, and just tell me, how you if you want to steer it in a different direction.
I think your idea is an excellent one, and I'd be very happy to go with it.
All right. Well, to start, then, many sort of misunderstanding about the theory of Caesar's Messiah exist. One of them is that it was created out of an understanding of history, that I have some sort of unusual understanding or information concerning the history of the era. Um, and that this then became, my presentation about the origin of Christianity. But in fact, Caesar's Messiah, the theory contained in my book, is just a literary interpretation of the Gospels, which indicates that the story of Jesus, particularly his adult ministry, was intentionally created as a sort of a typologic prefiguration of the war between the Romans and the Jews that occurred in 66 through 73 CE. Now, this seems a little complicated and perhaps far-fetched for people who are first hearing of the theory, but um, it's actually a very straightforward way of understanding the Gospels. And in fact, it's rather, in my opinion, shocking that my understanding of the nature of the literature that is contained in the Gospels hasn't really been widely understood by scholars before. And this is particularly true because there is a part of the typological system which basically looks forward in time from Jesus's ministry to the Roman Jewish War. There's a part of the system which looks backwards. In other words, Jesus's pre-ministry is also using the same typological system that looks forward from Jesus's ministry into the Roman Jewish War. But the part of his the pre-ministry that is actually basically a kind of typologic prefiguration is not something that scholars have any concern about. I mean, it's widely understood that this was what the author of Matthew was doing um, with his story of the pre-ministry of Jesus. And so I wanted just to go over it so that people can understand how um, the typologic prefiguration uh, genre is established in the Gospels, And basically, what the author of the Gospels did was to take names, locations, concepts from the Old Testament and use them to create a story of the character Jesus Christ. So let's just go through the system as it exists in the pre-ministry of Jesus Christ. So in Matthew 2:13, you have a character named Joseph who has dreams, and he decides to go from Judea to Egypt. Then in Matthew 2:16, you have the massacre of the children. Herod massacres, trying to find Jesus's person, and he has this. There's a story in Matthew 2:16. It's called the massacre of the innocents. In 2:20, you have a divine person appear and who indicates that they are dead who sought the child's life. So now you return from Egypt to Israel in Matthew 2:20. In Matthew 3:13, you have the passing through water. Jesus has his baptism. Now in Matthew 4:4, Jesus goes into the wilderness, and there he has three encounters, one of which is where he is tempted by bread. That's Matthew 4:4. And then Matthew 4:7, you have this Jesus admonishes Satan, saying, you should not tempt God. And then in Matthew 4:10, you have the story in which Jesus admonishes Satan to worship only God. Now, that is the kind of an outline of Jesus's pre-ministry, and it was extrapolated from the Old Testament. I'll go over it now and then explain this clearly. But what is it, to repeat, what the author of Matthew did was he took stories, little passages from the Old Testament, and wove them together into this story about his character, Jesus Christ, in order to create a kind of typological prefiguration. In other words, so that his character, Jesus Christ, could claim, or the people who believed in him could read Matthew's literature and then see that there was this hand of God over the character Jesus Christ that takes its reality from the stories in the Old Testament. Now, I'll go over the stories in the Old Testament, but the main thing is that they are visible, because in many cases they're verbatim. What Matthew borrows from the Old Testament is basically verbatim, but in many instances it's not. However, you can see the relationship when you realize that the primary way that you can see this connection is because they're occurring in the same sequence. In other words, the stories in the Old Testament that were used were then reused in Matthew in the same sequence. So therefore, you have in Genesis 45:50 the story of Joseph having dreams and deciding to leave Judea and going to Egypt. Then you have Exodus 1, you have the massacre of the children. Exodus 4, you have a verbatim quote, the one that is given in Matthew 2:20, and it is taken from Exodus 4, where you have the quote, "All the men are dead who sought the child's life." Very obvious parallel, and it's particularly vivid when you're reading these things in sequence. But now in Matthew, in the Old Testament, we have the story of going from Egypt to Israel. So it's the same as in Matthew 2:21. Now, Exodus 14 is an important parallel because you have the passing through water. Now, in Exodus 14, the Israelites have the divine passage through the Red Sea where they can leave the slavery of Egypt. Now, you wouldn't recognize this as a parallel to Jesus's baptism unless you are looking very carefully and looking in sequence, because you can see it's not verbatimism. Matthew simply took the stories and then used them in a general way to create the story of Jesus, but it's not verbatimism. You have the concept of passing through water, and of course, it's occurring in the same point in the sequence. Now, Matthew, in order to clarify this kind of complicated parallel, he gives a overt clue where he says, that God appears and says to Jesus, out of Egypt I have called my child. Now, this is the same. That quote is taken verbatim from the story presented in Exodus 14. Now, at this point, the Israelites go into the wilderness for 40 years. Notice that it's not verbatimism. Jesus goes for 40 days. The Israelites go for 40 years, but the number 40 is the same. So enough information is being communicated from one set of stories to the next, so that an alert reader can see that there is linkage between the Old Testament and the story of Jesus. So in the wilderness, you have the three stories that end up in Matthew, and here the relationship is verbatim because the quotes that Jesus uses are lifted right out of the Old Testament, and in the same sequence: the temptation by bread, and the admonishment not to tempt God, and the instruction to worship only God. So what has happened is that the author of Matthew took the Old Testament, took little passages from it, and used them to create the pre-ministry of his character, Jesus Christ. He used names, locations, concepts from the Old Testament and presented them in a story of Jesus in the same sequence. So to reiterate, it is names, locations, and concepts from one story presented in another story in the same sequence. And this is what you can call typological prefiguration. So this proves, among other things, that the character of Jesus Christ is fictional, because at least the pre-ministry, because typology is by definition a fictional genre. It is the using of one story to create another story, and the author who uses typology is not attempting to write history. He's making he's creating a particular literary point by using another story to give some meaning to a story that he's creating. And even though it may seem like the story that the author is writing, as in the case of Jesus Christ, is a history, in fact, it's simply a typologic genre the author is using, and that by definition cannot be history. So this answers the question, at least in terms of the pre-ministry of Jesus, as to whether or not he's a historical character. The pre-ministry of Jesus is describing a typological character. So this sequence has been widely recognized. It's obviously the correct way to understand the pre-ministry of Jesus, and it is not controversial. It's simply accepted by New Testament scholarship and by all alert readers as indicating that the author of Matthew saw the story of Moses as a kind of linked to his character Jesus Christ. He created this linkage, and it creates a kind of identity for Jesus. It indicates that he is sort of a new Moses. You see, he's taking all of these stories from the Old Testament about Moses and then putting them into Matthew's taking these stories and then putting them into his story about his character Jesus Christ. So this is widely understood by scholars. It's not controversial. What is controversial is then where my theory begins, really, is that what I maintain is that this exact same system is then used throughout the entire synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is used to create the story of Jesus Christ, his adult ministry. And rather than looking backwards, the use of this system in the adult ministry is looking forward to the Roman Jewish War, so that all of the events of Jesus's life, a great percentage of them, are typological. They are not historical events. The authors are creating using the history of the Roman Jewish War, and then taking those stories from the Roman Jewish War and weaving them into the story of their character, Jesus Christ. So exactly as in the pre-ministry, you have names, locations, and concepts which occur in Josephus in the Roman Jewish War that are used as the basis for the story of the character Jesus Christ, his adult ministry. So that is, I'm sure, enough for the this first section. In the next section, we will go over the first of these typologically connected passages between Josephus and the Gospels concerning the fishing for men. And there we'll show that the fishing for men event in the adult ministry of Jesus, it just repeats this, it is part of the system where the location, where it's placed in the sequence of the events in Jesus's ministry, and the concepts are parallel. So I think that will be enough for this first section, and I hope we will be able to go through a great many of the passages in the adult ministry of Jesus, and to show how they were typologically invented to create this hidden meaning to the Gospels, that Jesus's ministry was shaped to foresee the Roman Jewish War. So that will be all for today.
Oh, thank you so much, Joe. That's a fantastic beginning, and I look forward to hearing about the fishers of men